Hi, everyone, and welcome to the iSpring Solutions webinar series, where every week we talk about e-learning trends, share iSpring tips and tricks, and cover clients' cases. My name is Alice, and I will be the moderator for today's session. And today we are going to cover a super interesting topic. We will talk about training success formula, Ready, Set, Go, Show. And to cover this topic, we invited Geoff Rip, L&D consultant and entrepreneur. And today he will explain why this model is essential to successful training in the future. Hi, Geoff. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks very much, Alice. Thank you.
Okay, great. And I'm ready to give the mic over to you, Geoff.
Okay, well, I'm just going to jump into a 5-part agenda that we'll be covering today, and I thought that might be useful as a roadmap for what we're going to be going through. In some respects, part of what we're going to be covering is a bit of a personal journey, and I'll share with you in the background section in particular some of the experiences that I've had that have led me to the development of this model and this methodology. I think one of the important things that always comes up in a webinar is whether the slides will be available. So yes, I will make sure that a copy of the slides, in fact, they'll be sent out to everybody that has actually registered for the webinar. Okay, I've just for fun, I thought what I would do is make up a quote, and so there it is. And I was going to ask you to please keep this in mind as we go through the webinar. Put something into the chat. That would be absolutely fantastic if you could do that. It is obviously by the virtue of the fact that it is a webinar, it's going to be difficult for us to keep it interactive, but I think it would be helpful if we could have some information in the chat. I find I get a lot of value myself personally in attending webinars by seeing the comments that people put in the chat. Okay, so let's jump straight into the introduction. I was reading an article just recently in which the authors said that follow your passion is garbage advice. In fact, they were pretty tough on it. They said that it was amongst the worst bits of advice given and ranked up there along with the food pyramid and playing hard to get after a date, which I must say had me chuckling to myself. What they did advise was that if you, rather than follow your passion, is that it is better to develop a set of unique skills and expertise, and to use those skills and expertise to become successful, and that you will find that in fact you will become passionate. And it really, that's pretty much what when I look back on my career, what actually happened to me. I, in fact, never intended to get into learning and development. It sort of happened by accident. I was being trained as a retailer, and in my leisure time, I was doing a lot of sailing, and the offer came through to get involved in learning and development, and it meant I didn't have to work on the weekends. And so I jumped at the opportunity. So I can hardly say that I was highly passionate about it at the beginning, but over time, as I became more experienced and developed more expertise, I found that my passion for learning and development really grew. And there were really 3 things that, if I look back now, have, I guess you could call them values that have really developed over time. And so this whole methodology that I'm talking about today rests on these 3, what I think of these 3 key values. Then I've adopted a pragmatic approach. I believe that training should be practical and that we should share practical knowledge and skills with people. And if it's not practical, it's going to make it very difficult to apply and to develop training quickly. The other aspect which is important to me is that it should be based on proven techniques, and that the techniques and the research that on which the training is based should be evidence-based at least. And so I do a lot of desktop research, and I'm very careful to try and weed out the fluff and make sure that whatever techniques are being used are techniques that have been proven to work. I should also mention that part of that for me is lots of experimentation, trial and error, and making sure that that the techniques that I use are effective. And of course, that leads to the third point, potent. If the training in my mind isn't potent, and by that I mean doesn't produce the results that I'm looking for, then I've got a problem on my hands. I need to make sure that it's effective. So those are, I guess you could call them the three underpinning values that sit underneath this ready, set, go, show. I call it a model, but it's really a methodology. It's a whole process for developing and designing training that I've sort of evolved over many, many years, and has now got to the point where I use it for all the training designs that I put together. Just to touch on this, I think this is another really important point. You may be familiar with a fellow by the name of Donald Taylor, who runs a survey every year. It's called the Learning and Development Global Sentiment Survey. And he only asks one question. And that question is, what is hot in workplace learning? So every year he just changes the date. So in this instance, the beginning of this year, he said, what will be hot in workplace learning in 2021? And what was interesting, out of the 3,114, I think it was, practitioners that answered, number one on the list was reskilling or upskilling. And interestingly enough, it was a new item on the list. So it wasn't one of those items that moves up the list slowly. This was an item that jumped right onto the list and right to the top of the list. So there seems to be a general consensus out there in the marketplace that upskilling and reskilling is important. Now, why do I mention this? And the reason I mention it is because I believe that training has a key role to play in terms of upskilling and reskilling. And I don't want you to think that I'm adopting the view that training is the answer always. I actually firmly believe that training should not be the default option. We should always look for cheaper or more effective ways for helping to upskill people if we can. And if necessary, we then move to training, because that is going to be only if it's the right answer anyway. The other article that I read recently, which I thought was interesting, was an article in the Chief Learning Officer, in which they indicated that soft skills, these are the words they used, have always been significant, but now they are urgent. And they went on to say that there's a projection by Deloitte that soft skill occupations will account for roughly 2/3 of all jobs by 2030. So if that's the case, I can definitely see a need for training in the future. And if we're going to have that, then clearly we need to make sure that the training is effective. The reason I put this in by way of introduction to this session is I was listening to the CEO of a company called Mirasee recently, and he made this distinction between what's been happening in the marketplace between information and transformation. And one of the points he made was that a lot of what we call training was really information products, and particularly in the early years. And I was quite fascinated to read, I think it was, the name comes to me in a moment, Cami Bean, I think it was, who was quite critical about some of the earlier information style products that went out, particularly under the banner of e-learning. There seems to be a shift, and what I've noticed in the marketplace anyway is that more and more people are wanting transformation. And by that I mean they want behavior change, they want to see results in the workplace. So this model, this ready, set, go, show methodology and model, is really about the transformation. If you're looking for some way of providing information, then that's not the formula that you want to be using. Okay, a couple of things just to clear up before we get into the detail. I think it's really important to understand the definitions that I've been using and that underpin the model that we're going to be looking at. So I'll just ask these questions and as rhetorical questions, and then I will answer them. But obviously, I'll be really keen to hear what people have to say about it. So what is learning? In my mind, learning is something that is internal to the learner. It's cognitive, it's emotional, it happens inside the learner's head. And as an aside, that's why I'm not so keen on terminology like learning design, because I don't think you design learning personally. You can design learning experiences, you can design training, of course, but learning is something that happens in the learner's head. So what is training then? Well, training is a structured process for making learning happen. So you can call it an influence process, a process of facilitating learning, a process of supporting learning. It doesn't really matter what it is, but it's usually external to the learner, and it's something that is done in order to make sure that learning actually happens. Now that underpins the model that we're going to be looking at. So what is learning transfer? Now that's an interesting one, because learning transfer is a term that is widely misused. And from my point of view, learning transfer is basically any time that you access prior knowledge and use it in a new situation, that is learning transfer. A learning transfer is not just what is on the next question and what is training transfer, which is different. Training transfer is then taking information, knowledge, skills, whatever you've learned in a training event or learning event is I guess a better term, and taking that and applying that in the workplace. And as we'll see as we go through the methodology, that training transfer necessarily always involves learning transfer. Okay, so those are just some of the key definitions that I wanted to clarify before we jumped in the deep end. So here's a question for everybody, and I'd really appreciate it if you could just jot down in the chat, how do you know if training is effective? What is going to lead you to determine the effectiveness of training? And I could just as easily have used the word success. How do we know if training is going to be successful? Now, of course, I'll treat that as a rhetorical question, but the answer to that, in my mind, is if it influences performance. So performance is the key issue here. If training, change of behavior, thanks, Trevor, I appreciate that. Yeah, change of behavior, application of learning, it can be immediately applied. Thank you. That is exactly right. Training is not effective if all it does is fill people up with information, or if it's just about passing content to people. Training is effective if people are able to go and do something with it that certainly meets the objectives that we would have set beforehand. Yeah. And training certainly is a shorter period of time. And so just picking up on that point that's been made there is that I've tended to come from a background in the commercial world, working admittedly also with large commercial organizations, which includes government commercial organizations. And so there's a huge need there for training, which is shorter, and it definitely needs to produce behavior change. So that's the key word for me. We want behavior change, and we want to help people reach standards of performance that are important to the organization. There's one other thing that I want to throw into this, and that is that for training to be effective, we need to have a level of predictability associated with it. And predictability is a key component of the Ready, Set, Go, Show approach. We need to know that when we deliver training, that it has a high degree of predictability associated with that. Thank you, John. So yeah, we want to see a positive ROI. And I love that word proficiency, and I'll come back to that again later, but we want people to move towards competence and proficiency, two of my favorite words. All right, so a little bit of background. Now, I mentioned before that I'd sort of stumbled into learning and development almost by accident. What happened was I eventually worked my way up, and I got to the position where I was actually national training manager for a large retail organization. And I literally woke up one day feeling distinctly unloved, as I sometimes refer to it. And the reason I felt unloved was because I realized that training wasn't getting the sort of recognition that I thought it deserved, certainly not from the amount of work that we put into it, and how we saw ourselves helping the people at the front line and the managers that were out there in the retail stores. This is a very large chain with stores all over the country. And I part of what hit me was that people didn't see the value that we were providing from training. And if they were going to cut anybody's budget, it seemed to me that it was my budget that they'd want to come and cut. So I decided that I needed to go and do a lot of educate myself up more. And I actually ended up enrolling for an MBA program. And part of the thesis that I did for the MBA was to go back and study training effectiveness in depth. And here we are looking at some of the earlier models that I picked up in my research. Now, the reason I put these models in place is because if we go back all the way back to 1971 through to 1980, what we find is that there was this recommendation that training shouldn't be seen as an event, but that training should be seen as a phased approach. And as you can see there, that something would happen before training and things would happen after training. And this had a big influence on me. As I decided I would definitely start moving away from an event-based approach. Now, I want to bring us to the present. So if we come back to where we are today, and what I've noticed is that this event perspective is still dominant in the industry. We still have this language that people use. They refer to before training, during training, after training. And I frequently hear people saying things like, have you been to training? Or, what did you learn at training? Which is fine, but it seems to be very event orientated. And let me just focus for a moment on the e-learning component. And I know I'm going to talk about something that was published in 2015, but it's not too far back. So Cami Bean and Chip Cleary wrote an article for Learning Solutions magazine in 2015, and they said that e-learning has really dumbed down the training world. And in fact, they were pretty harsh about it. They said that it had helped to solidify an event-based mindset. They said it lived in a vacuum far too often, and that it was an event that often happened in an echo chamber with no real connection to the outside world. And when I read that article, I remember at the time thinking to myself, they're talking about this event-based problem that we have here, that too much attention is on the training event itself. And if you look at what I've written down there, a lot of courses and classes have been like that. And even a lot of the flipped learning was taking lecturing and basically putting it online. Now, I know that where we are today, a lot of that has changed, but nonetheless, I still see a lot of that around. So this is an article that was published in 2014, and I've left the author's name off because I didn't want to make this personal, but this is an example of what I mean about the language problem that we have associated with training. And if you look at this, what will you see? That the author talks about training and post-training. Okay, and one of the things that the author said in the article, I took note of, and I've actually made a note of it too, because I wanted to just read it out to you. He said here, the realities of building competence are much more complex than just putting together a training program. So what they're really saying is that they've put training in a box, and training is this thing that happens during the event. And if you want to get competence, well, it's going to be something that happens after the event. And I certainly agree with that, but my difficulty has been with the language that we use. Okay, so I then started going back to where I started to experiment. And my experimentation took me through a whole lot of different terminology. And there was a key reason for this. I wanted to put more emphasis on learning, but I also wanted to use a language that would speak to the learners. So here are some examples of the language that I was using in those early days. So if you look at the last line, we'd say to the learner, here, there's some pre-work, which they would get. Of course, they would maybe attend a workshop or more than one workshop. There would be an application project in many cases, and they would come back and share their application story after they'd implemented it. And we would obviously build in all the necessary supports and to help them along that route. That was fine, and certainly that was working for me. And I've noticed that many people have used similar models. So these are just some of the models that are currently in use around the globe. Okay, so I've chosen 6 of them. I've lost count of how many models I've actually recorded over the years and kept this information on file. But have a look at these, and what you'll notice, it's something that really hit me. If you look through these models, you will notice that phase 2 is largely about the learning. In other words, what we're saying is phase 2 is where the learning happens. And if you look at phase 3, the language of phase 3, the language of phase 3 is really about application. It's about the word transfer there comes up again. And what is being emphasized here is I guess we can call it the I sometimes think of it as the transportation model, where you pick your learning up from the learning phase and you take it back to the workplace and you put your learning back in the workplace. And the emphasis and the language is all around, you must use what you've learned. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't be doing that, but I have a problem because of what I'm going to show you next. And that comes from some research that I ended up doing. So I started to ask this question. I asked this question of managers and L&D professionals. And I asked this question over a period of about 2 to 3 years. And every time I went to an event, what I would do is I would ask them this question, this is now for learning and development people. Where on the scale are learners at the end of a typical training event? Now, that training event could actually be e-learning, but in many cases we were talking about face-to-face. So just think about that. Where do you think the majority of the learning and development people decided their learners were at the end of a typical training event? And the answer is advanced beginner. 98% of the learning and development people that I spoke to chose either advanced beginner or novice, but they did not choose competent. Now that begs a really important question. Why is it that people, certainly in the minds of the learning and development people that I spoke to, why is it that they do not become competent at a training event? There's a whole lot of reasons for that. You might want to, if you want to, pop something in the chat, because I'd be interested to know what you think. But I've found a variety of reasons that explain that. And one of them is the complexity of the behavior that we're talking about. So what we've got is, let's say you're talking about interpersonal skills. People come in with habits of mind. They come in with habits of behavioral habits. And those habits are not easy to overcome in a short period of time. They take a lot of time to do that. That was one of the reasons. The other reason is that many training programs may be just throwing a lot of content at people. And the content isn't going to enable them to change their behavior, certainly not in the training event. And so the bottom line is that people don't emerge from training events or learning events as competent. They may come out as novice or advanced beginner using this Dreyfus model of skill acquisition. So then I went and asked managers, and I said to the managers, there's a question, where on the scale do you think your people should be? Okay, where would you like them to be at the end after they've attended some sort of training? And the answer that came back is that they wanted their people to be competent. And that was almost all the managers I spoke to said their expectation of training was that people would be competent. Now, of course, we've got a complete mismatch here, because we've got managers that want their expectation is for competence, but we've got L&D people admitting that they can't make somebody competent through a learning event. And so that immediately said to me, okay, we've got a problem. If people cannot become competent in a learning event, then where do they become competent? And the answer obviously must be back in the workplace. The competence has to be achieved back at, Sean, thank you. You're saying attendance is just the start. It's like an apprenticeship. You have to go away and you have to practice application. Thank you for that. Absolutely. So competence is achieved by going back to work. It's not achieved in most cases in the learning event. The other thing we need to keep in mind is that most L&D people have found themselves under pressure to get more done in less time. And so often, training events are being scaled down, and there just isn't enough time for practice. In fact, there've been quite a few events that I've seen where there's been zero practice. It's all just been new information or new stuff that's being thrown at people. Here's an example of a realization of that was published in an article. Again, I've left the author's name off, but what was interesting about this, if you look at this diagram, you'll see that there's a recognition that on-the-job competence can really only be achieved later. But my problem with this is we back to this language issue where we're talking about training to give you, in this case, concept and task mastery, which I'm not even sure that is even possible with a lot of training programs, that we actually get people to that level of mastery. And then you've got transfer, which is apparently then driving on-the-job competence. So this is the issue that I was faced with, particularly as I ended up running my own consulting businesses, which is where I moved into, because my clients, they wanted on-the-job, they wanted performance. And my success in running my own training consultancies was, how do I deliver this training in a way that ensures that they get the success that they're looking for? Now, this is just to back up what I've been saying. This was actually published in, as you can see, in 2019. I attended a webinar that was run by David Perring from the Fosway group. And he put this up, and I actually asked him if I could use it, because what he said is that we need to look at learning differently. Learning has, in his mind, has these three aspects. You have to acquire some knowledge and skill. You have to actually go and practice. And then you have to put it into application. And through that process of application, you need to develop that knowledge and skill even further. The reality, and this is David's, based on research that was carried out in 2018, according to David, is that this is what we're still faced with. That the acquire is an event, it's content, or it's a resource. Practice, well, as you can see, that's your problem, and then you're on your own. So I guess what I've tried to do is summarize the problem as I saw it and some of the issues which I believe are still around. Thanks. It's definitely competence is the level that we're aiming for. So let me get into the process. Thanks, Russell. Time constraints is a big factor, absolutely. And thanks, Jason. Yeah, to win people over. So using evidence-based models, I think, is very powerful. And content-based training, thanks, Sean, you're true. That's absolutely right. It's easy, and it's much easier just to deliver content, but it's content on its own does not drive effectiveness. So let's have a look at the process. The Ready, Set, Go, Show model was my solution to the problem that I found. And I chose Ready, Set, Go, Show for a reason, because I remember at the time thinking of how do I get people to remember, and by people I'm talking about learners and their managers, to remember and understand what makes for an effective training program. And I needed something that was simple and practical, and that they could remember, and I could use that language on an ongoing basis. And I know that from my experience that expressions that people already have learned are much easier if you can get them to use those expressions. So everybody seems to be familiar with Ready, Set, Go. So I immediately saw an opportunity to use that. And then I was reading a book around memes and how to get information to stick. And the author said, rhyming is very powerful. Now, we know that rhyming, you just have to listen to advertisements to know how powerful rhyming is. And so I put Go, Show together. And ironically, it took me a long time to get to the formula. And I came up with lots of variations, but finally settled on Ready, Set, Go, Show. So Ready, Set, Go, Show is a learning sprint, as I see it. You can call it a pathway, a journey, a campaign, a program. These are some of the terminology that are being used. At the bottom there, you'll see I've put words like high performance learning journey, which is being used, but it really is a modern training program. And let me just quickly describe what we're talking about here. The ready phase is really about mindset. In fact, the key word that I use here is priming. It's about priming the brain for the learning that is coming next. I must point out, it's not about pre-work. Pre-work, in my mind, is where you're already into the content. The ready phase is not about pre-work. The ready phase is about heightening relevance, about helping people to see how important the training is, about linking it to their own personal needs and their own personal ambitions. It's everything that you need to boost motivation and forge a connection between what they maybe already know, but building to see how this is going to add to that without necessarily getting into a lot of content. And a good example of that might be I was running a finance program for a large company here in Australia. It was also a retail organization. And I asked the participants to go out with a set of questions that I gave them to interview the branch managers to find out why the branch managers thought that financial acumen was important. and to come back and be willing to share that at the beginning of a program that we were going to run on financial acumen. Now, yes, I'm not saying they wouldn't have touched on some content, but that wasn't the objective. The objective was to heighten in their minds the relevance and importance of what they were going to be learning. The set phase is what I think of as the foundational learning or the initial learning phase. It's where we provide them with the basis of learning that they need, and only enough to get them ready for the go phase. So we need to know that people have enough knowledge, enough skill, enough confidence to be able to go back and put it into action. If they don't have the confidence or they're insufficient practice in the set phase, then chances are they're not going to actually be able to go back and apply it in the workplace. The go phase, interesting enough, the go phase is where the real value is delivered. This is how we translate learning into results for the organization that are really valued. So the go phase includes quite a lot of important activities, which I'll touch on as we go further. But I want you to think of the go phase as another learning phase. This is where people go back and start to experiment and put things into practice and learn through the process of application. And finally, the show phase is where they reveal to their peers, to the people that were on the program, in many cases to their managers, what it is that they've done, but not necessarily what they did in the set phase, because we've moved beyond that now. We're now talking about what did they do in the go phase, what additional learning has happened, and what did they do to get results for themselves. So the show phase is often we refer to it as sharing and shining. It's where people are sharing information and they're getting recognition for the work that they've done in applying the learning that they've gathered all along that road. Okay, now it's more than a design model. When I say, obviously I use it as a design model, but if you just look at the older ADDIE formula, I've dropped the A off because I'm assuming for now that the analysis has been done. But we use Ready, Set, Go, Show in design. We use Ready, Set, Go, Show from a development perspective. I use Ready, Set, Go, Show in implementation. And we use Ready, Set, Go, Show from an evaluation perspective. Now, here's an interesting question for you to think about. How does this affect evaluation, how we evaluate a training program? Because remember, the training program, or when we use the word training, we're encompassing the whole of Ready, Set, Go, Show. It's not just the set phase. And it has a very distinct impact on how we approach evaluation. The other thing I wanted to say is that we look at it in terms of learning experience design. Now, I don't want to, get into the issue of what exactly is learning experience design compared to, say, instructional design or training design. And I know there are various opinions on this, but I'm looking at more in terms of we design experiences. And these experiences flow through all the Ready, Set, Go, Show phases. And the purpose of those experiences is different in each phase. And as I've described to you, in the set phase, for example, the experiences are designed to ensure people actually learn something and develop understanding and develop confidence enough so that they can move on to the go phase. The other thing that's important to keep in mind about this philosophy and approach is that it's not just purely linear. You can go ready, set, go, set, go, set, go, show, or whatever permutation suits you. It doesn't matter. It's just a learning sprint, and we're not dictating the technology that is used here. The set phase could be entirely online. So what I'm talking about there is that not the traditional blended learning, which would have involved some classroom style learning coupled with, say, e-learning. I'm talking about the set phase could be entirely online, and it could be a combination of self-paced and virtual workshops as well. The other thing I wanted to show you was this. This is the full model in what I call in 3D. So you've got Ready, Set, Go, Show. You've got what I call learners, leaders, and learning specialists. And learners include the participants that are going through the program. Yeah. This is what I call true blended learning. We are blending across dimensions. So we're blending the use of people, we're blending the phases, which is the experience, And we're blending digital technology in a combination of synchronous and asynchronous, incorporating at all stages collaborative learning, where people are going to, or you call it social learning, whatever, where people are going to be benefiting from learning together in some form or another. And that is probably the finest, I guess, summary in a diagram of what the Ready, Set, Go, Show methodology is all about. There are two imperatives in the go phase that you need to know about. These are very, very important. As you can see there, in the go phase, there are these two imperatives are to preserve and strengthen memory and to promote and support action learning. Now, both of these are important. And just as an aside, you can probably appreciate now why I feel that the 70-20-10 model for me anyway, is problematic, because the 10 in 70-20-10 is what they used to call formal training. But in most cases, it was identified as the set phase, or what I call the set phase. Because if you look in the go phase, preserve and strengthen memory, that's a formal process in many cases. It could involve micro learning and over time. But promote and support action learning is getting people to apply their learning in the workplace and learn from the process of taking action. And that's very much in the 70. And throughout this, we could have aspects of social learning as well. Okay, so where does learning happen in this model? Well, it's really quite simple. Learning happens throughout the model, but it's different. So learning happens in the ready phase, but that's not what we're not trying to get them to learn the content. In the set phase, yes, we want them to learn, as you know, it's foundational. Learning happens in the go phase in two ways, and learning happens in the show phase where people share what they've learned. It's very, very powerful in terms of its predictability in producing learning for the organization. So I've highlighted where the two key areas in which learning happen: in the set phase and in the go phase. We won't have time to spend on this, but you might want to think about it. Where do the following types of learning happening? And I've identified 3 types: learning away from work, which is out of the workplace, and quite often that's the set phase could be that. Learning at work, which is different from the next one, which is learning from work. Now, learning from work is learning while you're doing your work, and that will often happen when people are doing action learning. But learning at work, in the workplace, but not while you're actually doing the work, might be, for example, when you're doing exercises to reinforce learning and preserve and strengthen memory. Okay, so going back to David Perring, he wrote an article, and in the article he said this, and I thought that was very meaningful. He said that the big challenge for L&D, as you can see there, is not about forgetting curves. I see a lot of people writing about forgetting curves, and I see a lot of technology geared towards forgetting curves. Now, we're not saying that that's what they call it, learning decay, is not important. We have to address that. But we also need to be aware in the go phase is that our primary responsibility in the go phase is not just to help people to remember what they've learned, but to build their expertise, build their effectiveness, what you guys mentioned early on, to build competence, to move towards proficiency. So here's the training success formula on which this presentation is built. And as you can see there, we've got 4 components: ready plus set plus go plus show is what's going to help you become successful. The ready phase and the show phase are what we call bookends. In fact, I think of them as accountability bookends. If you don't have a ready phase and you don't have a show phase, you're going to have a lot less accountability built into a training program. The set and the go phases are the 2 key drivers of learning that are taking place. The set phase, as you can see, is the initial structured learning with practice, preferably. And the go phase is the retrieval practice, because we know retrieval practice is essential to actually remembering. And we also need real world practice in order to develop competence and proficiency. So what am I saying? I'm saying that if you are not designing a training program that includes both the initial learning and the on-the-job learning component, if you're not designing for both of those, then you are choosing to have a lower level of predictability associated with your learning. I'm not talking about training resources that learners help themselves do. I'm talking about structured training that we want to make sure is effective. Okay, so one of the best ways to understand this model and this process is to compare it with other models. And I love doing this because it's a way of testing. So every time I come across a new model, I test it against the methodology. And I'll just run you very, very quickly through these. BRINKERHOFF'S 4 core phases. What I like about this one, if you compare it to Ready, Set, Go, Show, and by the way, I haven't spoken to Robert Brinkerhoff about this, but this is my interpretation of, based on a presentation that he gave that the ready phase is about committing to the journey, and that makes sense to me. The set phase is certainly building a knowledge foundation. The go phase is largely about developing and practicing skills, but of course we also know that we must help people to remember what they've learned so they don't forget it. And the one bit that I don't include in Ready, Set, Go, Show, but is still very important for the individual, is to strengthen results. So BRINKERHOFF'S model is useful because it's looking at it from the perspective of the learner. It's saying, as the learner, you need to commit, you need to build, you need to develop and practice, and you need to strengthen results. And I believe the Ready, Set, Go, Show model can be used in a similar way. Will THALHEIMER, whose work I've been following for years, and Will is very well known as a researcher and a consultant and as a presenter, and produces amazing material. This is a model that you can find on YouTube. And what I did was I laid it over the Ready, Set, Go, Show model to see if what I was saying made sense in terms of all of Will's extensive research. And what you'll notice is that he identifies learning in 2 areas up front in this, what he calls the training intervention. And then in the performance situation, he's got on-the-job learning. So that's really important. And that on-the-job learning we must cater for remembering and prompting, of course, in order to get on-the-job performance. If you have a look at this one, this is Ryan Tracy. And let me just stop for a minute and say, if anybody, obviously you're going to get a copy of the slides, and you'll see the references at the bottom of the slides so that you don't have to worry about missing anything. But what I like about Ryan Tracy's framework is that it helps to identify a couple of key aspects that relate to the different phases. Like the ready phase, it's about attract me and motivate me. Now, yes, of course, motivation is important throughout Ready, Set, Go, Show, but it's particularly important in the ready phase. We know that people that are highly motivated in the ready phase and have clear expectations of application in the ready phase are more likely to apply their learning when they get to the go phase. Another part of this model that I like is that if he talks about under the go phase, he talks about support me and extend me. So one of the things that we do in the go phase is for those learners that want a little bit more challenge is we don't just reinforce what they've got. Sometimes we actually slip in a little bit of new information or new ideas as well. This is a fabulous book that was published in 2020. It's BOLLER and the book is called Design Thinking for Training and Development. And I've pulled out of that and tried to put it up against the Ready, Set, Go, Show. And again, you'll see some really important things in that model. What I wanted to highlight for you, if you look at stage 1, they say stage 1 is usually assumed, which means that in a sense it doesn't happen. Stage 2, thanks, Sean. Stage 2, if you look at that one, that's the typical focus, and that makes sense, doesn't it? Stage 3 is the most needed, and you'll see it overlaps with what I've been talking about, build, memory, and competence. And stage 4, which goes a little bit then beyond the Ready, Set, Go, Show, is to sustain, and it's often seldom considered. Okay. Last model, just quickly to run you through that. Now, I came across this on Springpoint, an Australian company, and they've apparently won awards for this. And I spoke to Megan Barrett and asked her if I could talk to this because it's such a interesting model. They call it their scaled behavior change design formula. And when I looked at it, I realized that those components related directly to Ready, Set, Go, Show. So what I've done is I've put them up against Ready, Set, Go, Show, and you can see the learning journey elements and the digital delivery options. And the reason I like this is because it emphasizes that we can use digital delivery at different parts of Ready, Set, Go, Show. So you'll see there that what Springpoint does is they use learning primers in the form of video, podcasts, curated content, and also virtual workshops, all clearly related to the set phase. in the go phase, they use learning transfer activities and coaching, very powerful. That coaching is an important part, not just manager coaching, but peer coaching as well. And I have found from my own experience that peer coaching is as good as any coaching by managers, certainly in terms of its impact on the application of learning and the additional learning that takes place in the go phase. So there, I've touched on both of those. McKinsey published in 2021, it's nice and up to date. I thought I'd put this in. McKinsey published a paper called Psychological Safety and the Critical Role of Leadership Development. And in that, they made the following point, which I thought was really relevant to what we've been talking about. And that is that the most successful learning journeys account for the rich learning that happens in day-to-day work and interactions. And so I'll go back to the point I'm trying to make. I'm convinced from my own experience that for any training program must include a designing for what people do after the learning event. We need to use modern technology and we need to use every bit of influence we've got to reach out into the workplace and influence how the learners are involved in applying the learning and learning from the process of application. And we can do it today because we've got the modern technology that enables us to do that. Okay, if you'd like to, feel free to put something in the chat. Anything that maybe is left out from you. And yeah, thanks, Rochelle. I was just looking at that. Many people these days do prefer asynchronous. And I think that people that are more introverted often benefit from being able to take their time on an asynchronous mode of delivery. Okay. Okay, I'm going to have to just move us into the last part of the program so we have some time for questions afterwards. But the question then comes, well, how do you improve training effectiveness? How can you make sure your training is more successful? And the answer to that is, from the way I do it anyway, is I see it as being able to pull two big levers. And I'm constantly working these levers as best as I possibly can. The first lever is well, we'll say first lever. Let me give you both levers and then we'll come back to that. But basically these levers are trying to use your direct and your indirect influence. So your direct influence is on the learners. So you need to, how do you use your ability and your training to influence the learners both during the event and after the event? And in fact, and before the event, of course, as well. It's absolutely crucial. And then how do you influence the managers directly? And what influence can you bring to bear on the managers? And why is that so important? Because we know the research tells us that the single most dominant influence on whether people actually apply their learning is their immediate manager. So here are just some final points to leave you guys with. What can you do? Well, I would say design new programs using Ready, Set, Go, Show. And a lot of programs today do not have a ready phase, do not have a show phase, definitely not. The bookends are missing, but also don't address what happens when people go back to work. There's no design for that. Audit your existing programs, see whether or not you can use this sort of methodology to bolt on to your programs. You can wrap Ready, Set, Go, Show around any existing program. And in fact, I believe that learners can be taught to do that. They can learn a skilled learner will in fact tend to wrap Ready, Set, Go, Show, even though they may not know they're doing it, around a learning event. Number 3, base your methods on the science of learning and instruction. There's a lot that I believe is not being applied or being applied effectively in training. And most importantly, harness the digital technologies to extend your reach. There are numerous digital technologies, in particular in the go phase, that we can use to ensure that we increase the predictability of learning. Now, lastly, how do you leverage your indirect influence? And the approach I've taken here is to recognize that any organizational culture is made of many, many smaller cultures. I could just call them team cultures without getting into the issue of what is a team or what isn't a team. And so if you want to influence the training effectiveness, the other way is to influence the culture. So it's almost like if I can give you a way of looking at it, you can either go a program by program approach where you're working on the program itself, or you can go on a culture by culture approach where you're working with individual cultures and the managers that are in those cultures. It brings to mind an old expression of what interests my manager fascinates me. People pay a lot of attention to what is important to their managers. And yeah, I want to just give you an example, a final example, which comes from Project Aristotle at Google. And I want you to have a look at these 7 questions. Just quickly glance through them. And this is scenario 1. What is the chances after someone has been on a training session that they are likely to apply their learning back in the workplace if this scenario applies? Just have a look at that. Number 1, if you make a mistake, it's going to be held against you. Number 2, people are not able to bring up problems. Number 3, people sometimes get rejected for being different. Yes. Number 4, it is safe to take a risk on this team. No. Number 5, it is difficult to ask other members of this team for help. Yes, it is difficult. And number 6, no one on this team would deliberately act in a way that undermines my efforts. We would say, in that case, the answer in this scenario is people would do that, and your unique skills and talents are not being valued and utilized. That is scenario 1. I would suggest to you that the chances of anybody going back and effectively putting their learning to work in that type of environment is pretty minimal. Now, these 7 questions were actually put together by Google to measure psychological safety. So psychological safety is not just important in a learning situation that is off the job or a learning event, but psychological safety, it matters in the workplace because it not for all the other reasons that we read about these days, but because it also affects the ability of people to go back and put their learning into action. Contrasted with the opposite scenario, the scenario where if you make a mistake, it is not held against you, and that it is possible to bring up tough issues, and that people on the team don't reject others for being different, and it is safe to take a risk. And when you look at it through that lens, you suddenly realize that the likelihood of somebody being able to go back and try out new ideas and be willing to fail is much, much greater. So I just wanted to leave you with that thought that psychological safety in the workplace is something that as learning and development professionals, in fact, is really important to us. Okay, questions. And I know we've gone through fairly quickly, but I would love to hear some questions. One thing I just want to say, if there are some questions coming through, I've mentioned quite a few articles. If anybody would like to get more information on those articles, I'd be quite happy if you just drop me an email to respond with a list of the articles that I've spoken about. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Trevor. He's asking, what would you recommend for third-party trainers only delivering the event?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I was actually hit with that situation a few years ago when I was working as a contract. I was brought into a contract, and they said, all we want you to do is just to deliver the event. So and I queried that at the time, which made it very difficult. Trevor, what I'd be doing, I guess, is encouraging the participants, if I could, and it wasn't against the contract that you're involved in, to take ownership and reinforce the message that the real value of what they're learning is only going to come about if they go and apply it. And I would build in some tips. So a good example at the moment is I've got a financial acumen program that I'm running through Engineers Education Australia, and we include recommendations for the learners at every stage of the program on how to be more effective, both in Ready, Set, Go and Show. So they actually emerge from that program not only having learned about financial acumen, but they actually emerge having learned how to be a better learner without having felt like they were going through a sort of learning skills program. The other thing I would do is I think I would talk to the third party talk to the client and try and see if there's any opportunity to expand the program to give better value. And I would certainly be pushing the idea that real value comes from being able to help people apply their learning back after the session. I've noticed a question from Sean, is it?
Yeah, Sean is asking, if a client asked for face-to-face, would you convince them otherwise?
My initial reaction is to say no, but then I would be asking is it only going to be face-to-face? Can you build in some components that are where people work, do some practice maybe in their own time? And if it's face-to-face, is it only one face-to-face session, or can you have a face-to-face session with a self-post session in between with another face-to-face session? There are those options as well. The other thing is that I think face-to-face doesn't preclude people doing something in the go phase either. So because there's no ways the go phase can be face-to-face, it's just not feasible these days, I don't think. I hope that I'm answering the question adequately, but I think face-to-face has a role to play, and I think it's very powerful. I know that I miss the opportunity to interact face-to-face with people, but I also know that a lot of the online stuff that we've developed over the last 12 months or so has actually become even more powerful than what we were doing face-to-face. Okay, is it Wui, I think? Can we achieve skill areas via online training? Yeah, again, it depends on the nature of the skill. If it's a cognitive skill, an interpersonal skill, I don't have any difficulty with that. I would look, for example, some of the work that I'm involved in, critical thinking. It's quite easy, in fact, to translate critical thinking skills into online training. Your problem is when you start talking about physical skills where you need to build muscle memory, and I know that we can do quite a lot more these days without necessarily relying purely on muscle memory. But I do think that there's some real value in people actually physically, obviously, doing things. I'm just trying to think of an example of a program that I was involved in, an online program where we used virtual reality to take people underground in a mine, and we had them experience what it was like in the mine, and they had to find areas within the mine where there were problems with the support systems. And if they didn't identify all the problems, the mine literally fell on top of them, and they could then reboot and start the process over again. And I thought that was very effective because the skill that we were developing there was the skill of identifying problems. And I think that can be done online quite easily. Just finding the file, the real portal phone. Yeah, I think it depends again on whether it's an analytical skill that you're developing or not. So again, I hope that I've adequately answered that question for you. Thanks, Alice. I appreciate your assistance.
Well, yeah, I think it's time to wrap up our session now. Thank you, Geoff, for such a great presentation and covering such an important topic. Thank you guys for joining us today and spending this valuable hour with us. Feel free to ask any questions you might have. We'll be happy to assist you.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thank you. And appreciate those who ask questions. I appreciate it.
Okay. So, yeah, thank you again for coming. Thank you, Geoff. And see you at the next webinar then.
Thanks again, Alice.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay. Cheers then.